Hello, everyone. I'm Helen, and I'm super excited to be joining you all at CodeLand this year, talking about one of my favorite things, where music and technology intersect. In the tech world, I'm the director of open source initiatives at an agency called 10up, where I have been for 10 years, which is a long time. A big part of my job is as a lead developer on a not so little piece of software called WordPress, which you may have used at some point because it's used on a percentage of the web that still blows my mind. Before tech, though, I was a musician. In reality, I'm still a musician. I didn't stop being one just because I work with code for a living. And the things I learned as a musician have deeply influenced who I am as a professional and as a developer. For a little context about who I am as a musician, I'm a pianist with my undergrad degree in piano performance from VCU and my master's in collaborative piano, or accompanying, from the Eastman School of Music, which is a major conservatory. I mention this not as credentialism, though I am very proud of what I've done, but to underscore the seriousness of my study and how deeply embedded this thinking remains for me. There's so many things that music has impacted in my second career as a developer, and I've talked about some in the past, both being disciplines of lifetime learning, understanding of how a system of notation executes over time, and so forth. Today, I'm going to focus on one area, feedback, and in particular, feedback literacy. Feedback literacy is about how you make sense of information and use it to get better, learning how to learn. Take a moment to think about how you've experienced feedback in various areas. For many people, especially students and those early in their careers, the feedback you've experienced has been on the receiving end. That feedback is often quantified, like grades, or only comes when the giver feels like something needs to be corrected. We often wait until critical moments to deliver feedback, unnecessarily increasing the pressure on both giver and recipient, and reducing our opportunities to practice feedback. Because here's the thing about feedback. It isn't just about telling somebody what you don't like. Feedback is a process that can be thought of as a cycle, and we can all grow more in our work and our lives if we embrace the whole of what feedback really is and make it a part of what we practice. Here are the primary components of feedback. The first two will likely seem a little more obvious: giving feedback and receiving feedback. The other two parts are the real key to what makes feedback a process and something you need to be literate in: processing feedback and actioning feedback. So how can we do that? We can take a look at how this is done in the world of music. If we were in a room together, I'd start by asking you to raise your hand if you've ever taken private individual music lessons. Since we're not, I'm going to imagine that some of you have, and that perhaps more of you have participated in music groups like choir or band. If you're also coming from a musical background, I'd love to hear about it and want you to know you're not alone. These are the primary components of private music instruction, and these serve as venues of feedback as a musician, in particular as a student, but that are still experienced as a working professional. These are lessons, studio classes, and master classes. Private lessons are a lot like having one-on-ones at work. They happen on a regular cadence, typically weekly, and are between teacher and student. You come prepared to every lesson with what you are supposed to be working on during the week leading up to it. You work through those things and see not only how you accomplished your goals, but how your personal practice got you there, what you might need to do with that personal practice to get better with it, and then figure out what's next and what you can tackle in the upcoming week, all to get you to some broader goal. In this context, most of the feedback is from the teacher to the student. Studio classes are probably not a familiar concept to you unless you have done somewhat more serious music study. Your studio is a group of students who share the same teacher with you, and a studio class is a group class that happens on a regular cadence, much like lessons, though they may happen less frequently. For studio class, you and any other collaborators come in and perform for your teacher and peers. This can be really nerve-wracking because there's something about performing in front of peers that really puts the pressure on. You typically play pieces that are well on their way to being performance ready, though perhaps not fully polished yet. You might think of this as a parallel to a beta release in software. You may have heard some of this type of advice in the past, where you're giving feedback and somebody tells you what to do with that feedback. So you start with something complimentary, avoid following the compliment with but, focus on something constructive that can be actioned upon and not just something you don't like. So after you've performed, your teacher and other students in the class are going to give you feedback based on what you've just done. And it's not just a venue for your teacher to give you more advice, because your teacher has been giving you advice each week during your lesson, but it's an opportunity for the students in your studio to also practice giving feedback, to be able to shape that feedback, and for you to practice receiving that feedback in that type of group setting. As a performer, you may try some of those things out in front of the group based on the feedback, which is also you actioning that feedback, but also providing feedback back to the giver, letting them know if the way they communicated their thoughts was effective. Master classes are a bit of a mix of the two. They are special events that happen with invited guest artists, where you get up on stage and perform something that is performance ready, looking for feedback and wisdom from an established artist you may otherwise not have a chance to learn from. For some master classes, you may even have to audition for them, and that's pretty wild if you think about it. You compete for a chance to have somebody criticize you in front of an audience. But again, that's the value we put on that feedback, and as nerve-wracking as that may be, master classes are frequently special memories in the course of our study as musicians. While you're up there on stage, after you've performed to applause, the guest artist will essentially give you a lesson in front of the crowd. So not only are you receiving feedback, you're expected to process it and do something about it on the fly, live, right there in front of everybody. You might not always agree with what the artist is saying, and that's okay. The point is not to agree or even necessarily make a decision about how you feel about what they're saying in the moment. That's a lot of pressure. It's about respecting their time and expertise and demonstrating that you understand what they're saying. You can then decide in your own practice later whether it's a thing to keep, but that ability to be flexible, think fast, and try new things is very important to practice as well. So let's revisit the components of feedback, this time demonstrated by a live musical example. I'm really excited to be able to do this as a part of this talk. I do miss getting to meet people face to face at conferences, but on the bright side, doing this live from my home means that I can be at the piano. I'm going to use a very short excerpt from the famed Moonlight Sonata by Beethoven as an example of how this might go in a studio class or masterclass setting. I promise you don't need any musical knowledge. I'm going to try to be as straightforward as possible. So here's the excerpt. In a real masterclass, you would be playing the whole movement or even the whole work, and the audience would applaud. So after that applause, the artist might say something like, "I really appreciated how faithful you were to Beethoven's markings on the page and how precisely everything was executed. I'd like to explore the section a little more and see if we can shape it to be even more compelling for the audience." The name of the sonata comes from a posthumous review that likened this movement, this section, to moonlight shining on a lake. So we don't know if that's really what Beethoven intended, but let's go with it. So if we're thinking about moonlight on a lake, it's shimmering and it's smooth. Let's see if we can make this smoother. So you, as a performer, take a moment, maybe imagine some moonlight on a lake, and play again, more smoothly this time. artist says, "Great, that's already feeling more like we're light gliding on the water. Now, let's add a little more flair to communicate our intention." The composer has marked a crescendo and a diminuendo, which is getting louder and then softer. So let's exaggerate that a little more and take just a hint of a pause before the quietest moment to make it more dramatic. Now we're getting somewhere. We've taken this very small section from faithful and literal to what's on the page to something that hopefully communicates light and smoothness and a little bit of mystery. Even if you're not musical yourself, hopefully you were able to hear some of the changes. Something to note about the examples I just gave is that feedback can be abstract or it can be concrete. The first part, saying to play more smoothly, is a bit more on the abstract side. It's on you and your skills to translate that idea into the execution, whether that means using more pedal to blur the notes together or going a little faster. The second part, giving direct advice on volume and timing, is concrete. It's giving you specific instructions to execute on. Feedback can come in both ways, and knowing when to deploy each one is important. Abstract feedback is often better suited to those who are more advanced in their study or discipline, as you need to have some baseline technique in place, as well as experience to be able to take action on it. Concrete feedback can be thought of as something like a code review, where you're going line by line and giving direct, immediate feedback about parts of the code. This type of consideration about what type of feedback to give is because feedback is very much contextual. There's the context of the giver and the receiver, as well as their relationship, and then the broader relationship to the setting. In a lesson or a one-to-one, you may get more experimental and try things that are risky or a bit more of a stretch than you might want to be attempting in front of an audience. There's also a reason why master classes are not about general audience commentary. Studio classes work because you have context with your studio mates, but a public audience does not have the context of you as a performer, nor do you have context for where they're coming from. This is an imbalanced dynamic that you may end up experiencing in tech. I personally very much have, because I work in the open source space, where feedback comes at you from all angles at all times. It is very difficult to receive feedback in large public forums, and all the more so if you haven't had any practice receiving it in group settings in the first place. It's also something I think about often in the context of social media, where the ability to receive and process feedback at that type of scale just isn't reasonable, but I digress. Feedback is also a two-way street. Like I said in the beginning, feedback is not just about telling somebody what you don't like about what they're doing. There's feedback on the feedback, very meta, and there's showing that you're receptive and processing that feedback. That's what makes it a cycle and not a task. In order to have a cycle for a practice that is by definition involving at least two people, not that you can't give feedback to yourself, I suppose, you have to collaborate. When I say that I have my master's degree in collaborative piano, that's a very literal description of the discipline. We don't play pieces on our own as soloists, we specialize in playing well with others. As another musical example for my specialty, let's take this song from Debussy, Nuit d'étoiles, or Night of Stars. This is a collaborative effort between pianist and singer, and in addition to lessons and group classes, you also have rehearsals with each other and are giving each other nonverbal feedback as you play. If I were to just bang out the notes as written down on the page without further thought, much like I did with the Moonlight Sonata, it would go a bit like this. No amount of magic the singer could work would be able to overcome what I'm putting out. I've turned this from a night of stars into somebody plodding through quicksand. Now, as a seasoned professional, I know that my job as a collaborative pianist is to have at least a rudimentary understanding of the French, both the translation and the diction or pronunciation. But if I haven't done my work, or I've lost sight of it, or if I'm just not experienced enough to know that yet, hopefully in our rehearsals, the singer will let me know I need to make this a bit more sparkly, like stars in the night. And then it's my job to receive that feedback, figure out what to do with it, and give them the musical feedback they need to work off of. Already much better. We can think of this as something parallel to working cross-discipline in tech, where many of you watching this today are developers or identify yourselves as developers in the tech space. This is like working with a designer, right? Where both parties need to be aware of the other, whether you can actually do the other thing or not. We're not going to get into, should designers code, should developers design, but you need to be aware enough of what the other party is doing so that you give them that respect of giving them the support that they need so that you are both able to execute on the things that you want to be accomplishing. All right, so what can you as a developer do with this information? First and foremost, you need to be proactive in seeking feedback. While I'd love to say that this industry has got it all figured out, in reality, tech is a relatively new field in the grand scheme of things, and we're kind of all still figuring it out. In seeking feedback, you need to be prepared to receive it, process it, and action upon it. You also need to be prepared with whatever you're seeking feedback on. Master classes mean you are prepared at a performance-ready level, the launch, if you will. The same goes for studio classes, which I compare to beta releases, and lessons, your weekly check-ins, where hopefully you've done something since your last check-in. And if you work in an agile type of methodology, you very much are supposed to have your tasks done for the week. Make sure that your one-on-ones, whether you're the report or the manager, actively include feedback in both directions and are not always just times to talk about what's got you stuck or plan everything for the upcoming week. This also means practicing all aspects of the feedback cycle very deliberately. You may want to seek out feedback in more low stakes types of contexts, like one-on-ones or finding trusted peers at work or in another community, so that you have good opportunities to get that practice in. For any managers who are watching this, and for anybody who may find themselves managing or being in a leadership type of position in the future, create these lower stakes contexts for your discipline group. I've really enjoyed when groups meet regularly, perhaps weekly, and rotate between each other, presenting on something interesting they worked on recently, whether it's at work or not, and giving others a chance to discuss it. This gives people a forum to show off something they're excited about, peers to learn how to shape any feedback they might have about a thing and learn how to ask thoughtful questions, and for everybody to generally get to know each other better and bond as a team. As a manager or leader shaping these forums, be mindful about frequently recontextualizing and reminding everybody that the feedback being given is being workshopped just as much as anything else that's being worked on. By making these into regular and predictable events, you make practicing feedback a normalized part of the work cycle. And if you're able to also do these periodically in cross-discipline groups, it can be a really valuable way of gaining understanding of how other areas work and think and how to communicate with each other. So for instance, you may have a group meeting weekly where somebody comes in, scheduled for the week, and says, I'm going to present on an interesting thing that I worked on this week, something that was challenging for me, and I want to share what I've learned. So they share it with the group, and then the group may ask questions, they may have feedback, may suggest other paths to take as a developer, interesting libraries, related concepts. And then it's on the group to also help each other understand When is this feedback being delivered in a great way? And in technology, you may experience people who are not good at giving feedback, right? And it's also a chance for them to practice that. And like I said, to receive feedback on that feedback so that they also can grow in their communication, right? And the way that they learn and how they learn how to learn. They say that one of the best ways to learn things is to try teaching it to somebody else. And that's a part of this as well. Giving your feedback is maybe not directly a teacher-student relationship, but it is in that same vein, right? Where you are sharing something that you know in a productive and constructive and positive way with somebody else so that they are able to do something with it. I also highly recommend watching a classical music masterclass sometime. Going in person would be great. I might not recommend this right now. I'm not sure they're even happening. But for the moment, there are tons of them online. In particular, I highly recommend looking for a masterclass with Benjamin Zander on Bach's Cello Suite No. 2, where he does just an absolutely phenomenal job of contextualizing and shaping feedback. And Amanda, the cellist, responds in impressively flexible and smart ways. I promise you don't need to be a musician to get something out of it. He explains things for the general audience, which does include non-musicians, and the music itself is beautiful. Another easy way to find this masterclass is I have a blog post on a similar topic, and it embeds it at the bottom. So thank you all so much for joining me today. It's been an absolute delight to be a part of such a great event and get to share this bit of the music discipline that I want to see more of in technology. And I want you to give me feedback too, please. There's a post up on Code Newbie, which you can find on my profile at community.codenewbie.org/Helen, and leave me that feedback in the comments, and I'll be responding to them throughout the event. Also leave a link to that masterclass in the comments so you can check it out in between things today or at your leisure. Enjoy the rest of CodeLand 2021.